Welcome, everyone. We're so happy that you've decided to join us today for this very important topic, inclusive hiring and working with people with disabilities. I'm Francesca Burack, the chair of BPW International's Development, Training, and Employment Standing Committee team. We are so lucky to have three wonderful experts in the disability field with us today, and I want to thank each of them for coming. Amy Camilleri, Zara, Emily Kaska, and Shri at Lori. And thank you also for all of your time in our discussions for preparing for the panel. So in our pre-panel discussions, we decided that we weren't going to make bios because everyone has seen the bios on the registration link. But people will be introducing themselves in a few minutes. At the conclusion of our closing remarks, we will have a resource list for you so that you could take a photo and be able to follow up on everything that we've covered today. Over the past few years, we hear a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, primarily focusing on highlighting racial and cultural respect and recognition. But very rarely do we hear about people living with disabilities. If we do, it's usually an afterthought and not part of the pillars of the DEI conversation. Yet statistics are staggering. I went to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the US government-run organization, just to look at a statistic. And I was shocked to see that 1 of every 4 Americans are living with a disability. The percentage that they used was 28.7%, which is 1/4 of the population of Americans. Adult Americans. This doesn't even take into consideration younger people that have disabilities. So why does this happen? That's a really good question. And we on this webinar can change the conversation. So let's start with our panel. Why did you get involved in this area?
Sorry, Francesca, may I interrupt you?
Yes.
We have our president here. Maybe she can say hello to
hi.
people here.
Here's our president, Catherine Bossard, who's coming in to say a few words. You look like you're either in a car or
I'm in a taxi. We have here a Tempest train in Rome. It's incredible. If you do a step out of the house, you are wet like something. So I would like to say hello to everybody. I'm very, very pleased, and thank you very much, Francesca, to organize this interesting panel. I think it's important that we are, all of us, inclusive, and that we realize that there are, if you are as happy and sane and healthy, that's wonderful. But if it's not the case, if you have a disability, I had several operations, and once I was lower than other times. And then you suddenly realize that the so-called normal world is not made for people who are slower, for people who have more problems. I learned a lot through our dear communications chair, Ursula, when she suddenly was on her wheelchair, dashing down the city of Bern, and I almost had to run behind her to be able to make it. But I think she is a real wonderful exception. But it is different. You have to cope with your problems, your difficulties. And I think also as an employer, one has to be very aware of the fact that people are very alert, have a fantastic education, but might have problems due to some physical disabilities. And I think it's very important that we are aware of this and we take this into account, because we might lose very, very precious employees and collaborators. I wish you a lot of interesting inputs. I have to attend here the conference in a very short time, and I wish you great time. It's probably my last webinar I'm attending too. Next time we'll be in St. Kitts for those who can, and otherwise somewhere else on this planet. Thank you for everything, and thank you for organizing this fantastic panel. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm not sure that I mentioned the Q&A session that we will have at the end of our presentation. So if you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A box and we will make time for questions and answers. So I think we were about to start with brief introductions about how you got started in this field. And why don't we do this one alphabetically? Amy, we'll start with you. And so what brought you here? What's your passion? How did you get involved?
Okay, I got involved in a way partly by chance, but also partly by conviction, in the sense that I started my educational background is primarily in mechanical engineering, so that is what I started studying at university. Throughout my course, when I was 21, I acquired a physical impairment due to contracting meningitis, so I lost both my legs. And that is basically how I got involved in the sector, first as an activist, eventually also as an academic. So I read for a master's degree in disability studies, and that led me to set up, co-found an NGO, which works with amputees in Malta, and eventually also my academic career. I'm now head of department, and I also lecture with the Department of Disability Studies at the University of Malta.
Thank you. Emily, let's.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for having us from all areas of the globe. I'm dialing in from Australia, so it's 11 p.m. at night here. I think, Francesca, what got me into this, I think really at the core of it is I have the honour of being a sibling. My sister Lucy has a very severe intellectual disability. We're only 1 year apart, and intellectual disability is often quite an invisible disability, so we didn't know about her disability for quite a few years. And I think it's probably, I always say that siblings' disability is almost ingrained in us, because I don't know a world without disability, because I was only one when it came into my world. But through that life, I've noticed that we are both women, same upbringing, same families, same town, but our lives have diverged so much, not just because of her disability, but I think more so because of how our society and employers and others haven't adjusted to her disability, and we live such vastly different lives. And here in Australia, there's some really striking stats, I think, pertinent to this group. The employment rate of people with a disability here, Down syndrome in particular and intellectual disability, is only 8% in open employment, where my friends without a disability, it's 76%. And I think also probably pertinent to a group like business and professional women, women with a disability are even further disadvantaged in things around sexual assault and violence, more than 2.5% than I, to walk out in the street today. And so that's something that I think from my personal perspective with my sister has really affected me. And then 20 years ago, I had the absolute pleasure of working with our community of our loved ones with Down syndrome. And that fast forward now has led me to found my own NGO, the Down Syndrome Institute, because in Australia, we don't know how many people have Down syndrome. And whilst Down syndrome itself is a genetic condition, the most common in the world, I'm sure a lot of us on this call would know what Down syndrome is, and it's quite recognisable. We actually don't know a lot about the condition itself. So again, I think knowledge is power. And so that's what's really driving me with my institute, is that together to better understand Down syndrome, and also to showcase to the world that our loved ones with Down syndrome can do anything and everything. And I think if we adopt more of the social model of disability, which is what are the impairments in the world around them, as opposed to what are the deficits in the person, I think we can see that anything is possible. And so I think that's what really drives me, that we really start to see the person, not the disability, and actually reflect on our own biases, our own stereotypes, our own barriers that we're putting on people with a disability that I see happen every day to my sister and not to me. So I think that's really what drives me, and it's such an honour to be here today.
Thank you. Shri.
Thank you. Thank you, BPW International and Francesca. Just to start, I think you guys are doing a fantastic job. Emily, the statement you mentioned about anything is possible. We are all examples. And this is a journey of doing something. And we don't know why we do things. And it was an accident. In 2019, I'm an executive. I run a large quality engineering for a large financial firm. And there is a vendor who places people who are autistic into the workplace. And when that gentleman reached out to me, I did not know what I was dealing with. I did not know why I had to hire people who are neurodivergents. And I did not even know that word. I had a conversation. I got myself educated. I understood what is neurodiversity and why there is unemployment and underemployment exists in that spectrum of people. And I thought, seeing is believing. I personally would like to experiment and experience. For that reason, I had an opportunity to run a pilot with 5 people for 6 months. And the results were phenomenal. And the results were 10x. And the outstanding results that I have seen with the pilot, I went to my executive team and I not only convinced them, and it was an opportunity to make that as a program across the firm. And we started as neurodiversity at work. And that created employment for many, not 5. We started getting them not only into quality engineering, but into every other job family. And I learned a lot. And while I was working, I understood that there are qualities which we are going to discuss during this session, but that was a starting point. But that's not the end of it. It's a journey. I kept continuing in that journey. And at every stage, I started to learn. That's an opportunity, I would say. And we'll continue more. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yes, so it's interesting to look at the broad spectrum because each of you are living in a different area of the world. Malta, Emily's from Australia, Shri lives in the United States. So we have, somewhat of a global perspective here on this area. And one of the things I was interested or that we discussed was the difference in governments and in government support for people with disabilities. So what is going on in your countries? For us in the United States, 30 years ago, the Americans with Disability Act was passed in 1990. I remember the demonstrations of people living with disabilities going to Washington, marching on Washington, laying in the street so cars could not pass, just to get the attention that they were not getting for employment, for transportation. And we'll talk about the advances that have happened, but what's going on in terms of your country? And Shri, I'm going to start with you since I mentioned the ADA Act of 1990 that was also upgraded, I don't remember the year, to include others. And one of the areas that they talk about is, quote, accommodations. And if you could talk a little bit about some of the accommodations that people don't talk about. So let's review on that.
I definitely can cover that. And since it's a practical approach, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, making sure you comply. Most of the employers tend to do just to comply. But rather than doing it as a tick in the box exercise, understanding that these are accommodations that are needed not only for disabled individuals, but for everyone. I think some of the ones that I personally have experienced, I'll share a few examples. So there is a request for a quiet place where neurodivergent individuals spend some time there, not to have sound pollution around them. And that's a choice. And it actually helps them. When you really have a quiet place, it not only helps neurodivergents, but for everybody. And there is another accommodation where you go to a meeting where you know what to expect, having an agenda. And we just get into a meeting and talk about anything and everything without having that specific agenda would actually put neurodivergent people under a lot of stress. Having an agenda is a good thing for everyone. And you basically tend to cancel the meeting 5 minutes before the meeting, or 10 minutes before the meeting, or 15 minutes before the meeting. Or you change the timing of that meeting. Why don't you stick to what you say you do? That's not only good for neurodivergents, but it's good for everyone. These are basic accommodations, some of them. I think we need to start to realize some of these accommodations are helpful for every single person. And specific to ADA, making our systems be built, software is built to comply. What kind of font to use and what kind of colors to use on the web page, for example. It is actually a good thing. If you comply with ADA rules, it's good for everybody. Because if you have very little fonts, you may not be able to see it. There are standards that drive these things. And I would say ADA, not only as an act, but with the heart, people should follow ADA and beyond, just to make sure the respective accommodations are appropriately met, and that should be embedded into everyone's life versus tick in the box. That's what I would say, Francesca.
Thank you. Emily, you have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think Francesca, and it's a really valid point that Shri mentions, and it's something I reflect on a lot, that there's accommodations and adjustments that are needed, but my biggest caution and urge around that is that they're not concessions. They're not an easier way out, because our loved ones with Down syndrome and other disabilities deserve to be challenged in the workplace and deserve to have the opportunities like the rest of it. We might just have to go about it in a different way. And in Australia, I think if you looked on paper, from a legislative point of view, you would honestly think Australia is rocking it. Like, we have disability inclusion covered. We were one of the first to sign up to the UN Convention on the Rights of People with a Disability. And I am very honoured to attend New York each year as an Australian delegate for that. At the national level, we have a Disability Discrimination Act, we have a Disability Services Inclusion Act, we have disability education standards. Then we've got a whole raft of strategies, Australia's disability strategy, we have a national autism strategy, we have a national disability employment strategy, we have a national disability insurance scheme. So tick box, we are rocking it. But when you actually look at, is this positively moving the needle for our loved ones with disability? The labour force participation rate for people with a disability hasn't moved here, unfortunately, in 20 years. It's stayed static despite this investment and despite the legislation that does give us a very robust framework. And also, something that I find troubling is that people with disability in Australia are living longer than ever before. So I know, particular to our loved ones with Down syndrome, when I was born in the 80s, their life expectancy was about 25 years of age. Now it's 60 plus, and it's the same in America as well. So that's amazing. It's such a great news story to be celebrated. However, despite all this legislation being in place, they're not being employed more. We're seeing Australia has probably one of the highest termination rates as well, at about 96% for our loved ones with Down syndrome, based on a lot of misinformation and some of those old stereotypes. And so I think on paper, tick, Australia looks great, but that translation into practice for our loved ones with the disability, whilst in some ways maybe getting better overall, we're still not really authentically including and making the accommodations and the adjustments for our loved ones with disability in this country.
Thank you. Amy, do you have anything
Yes,
to add?
Yes, definitely. In Malta, the situation is very similar to what Emily is describing in Australia. So we've actually had an Employment Persons with Disability Act since 1969, which is obviously, considered quite avant-garde for the time. So at the time, they had actually introduced a 2% quota for companies employing more than 20 people. It was not enforced as much. In fact, in 2015, amendments were made to that piece of legislation in order to introduce fines for companies who are not actually abiding by the quota. We also have disability strategy. We've signed and ratified the UNCRPD. We've actually transposed the UNCRPD into an act, so into Maltese law. So we have the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 2021. It's just basically a photocopy of the UNCRPD itself. But then when it comes to, on the ground, as we say, we're not really seeing any significant changes. So as Emily was saying, persons with disability, looking back to the COVID pandemic, they were the first ones to have their jobs terminated. So I think it's a question also of changing attitude. So I believe, legislation is very important because it's important to have something black on white. But unless you use that legislation in order to teach as an educational tool, then I think it's a bit, I wouldn't say useless, but you need to have it reinforced, and you need to also to have the funding to be able to implement it. So you need, some people might need support in order to be able to go. So job coaches and people to support them and find the right employment for them. I also wanted to add to something that she was mentioning, how certain accommodations are good for everyone. A few years ago, I co-wrote a chapter with some of my colleagues, and that was actually the title of the chapter, which was "What is good for us is good for everyone." And I think that is, very important to keep in mind, that disabled people are not asking for, rocket science, but we're basically asking for very basic, sometimes very basic accommodations, which are not costly, because that is another misconception that, some employers might have, that when you're going to employ a person with disability, you're going to incur some extra cost. But very often it's, adding, most accommodations, we're talking, using the mobile phone, for example, are actually inbuilt in the phone, so all you have to do is make sure you activate those accommodations in the phone. So it's not, there's also other misconceptions in relation to that, disabled people are going to take a lot of sick leave, for example. Actually, no, research shows us that disabled people are actually more loyal to those employers who actually do give them a chance to be employed and to perform. So maybe, legislation is not the be all and end all, in the sense that it is important, but it's one of the many pillars that we need to have in order to have successful hiring of persons with disabilities at work.
Yes, thank you. So this was a very good background, and we're going to sort of start to switch. But Emily, I too looked up some statistics, and the employment rate for people with disabilities in the United States really hasn't moved that much either. So it's a worldwide problem that we're dealing with here. And as you've all talked about it, a major component of this is attitude. And the way to change attitudes really is through education. So let's move. We had the mother of the disabilities movement here in the United States, Judy Human, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, who was in a wheelchair, got a teaching certificate, and could not get hired because she was considered a fire hazard. In case there was a fire, how would she get the kids out? And this was years ago. Thankfully, that has changed. So things are changing, and there are ways to be successful in inclusive employment of people living with disabilities. So let's focus on that now. What are some of the tips and the tools? And what about us as allies? How can we be advocates and allies in successful employment of people living with disabilities? And then also, why is this so important? Okay, let's start with Emily. We didn't start with you yet, so let's have you begin.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. And I love this question because I think it probably for all of us on this call, why don't we reflect on for us all, why is work important? Like we don't just go to work for our pay packet. It instills joy. We have pride. It gives us, yes, financial security. We get career progression. We get skill development. And most importantly, we get to generally, fairly freely choose what jobs we might want to do. And I think the first thing I'd say is that should be no different for people with a disability. And then the second thing I would say is that coming from our own stereotypes and biases, it's good to understand and I think always remember that this isn't a nice to do. We're not doing this as a favor to the person with a disability. And if I go back to what I mentioned at the start, the social model of disability, and it's actually not about the person's impairment and disability. It's about us and our responsibility to create a less disabling environment around them. And that's something that I think can get a bit lost, particularly in employment, because it's often seen as, oh, well, there's a lot to invest in making those adjustments and those accommodations and the time. But actually, studies show the opposite, that the benefit to the employer far outweighs the benefit to the employee. Less turnover, more committed employees. They always get higher scores from their customers because they actually have a workforce reflective of their customer base. Like you said at the start, Francesca, 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. Does your workplace have 1 in 4 people with a disability to reflect your customer base? There was a study done in Australia that if we lifted our labour force participation rate, our economy would be better off by $43 billion in just 10 years. So the economics are there. And often I think that that's not talked about a lot. It's often seen as something nice to do, potentially even sometimes a ticker box approach. Now, I'm not averse to that if it's ticker box or nothing, but something that I think is really important and the successful driver of what makes employment work is that it needs to be really authentic inclusion with thoughtfulness, with intent from the employer, from leadership, all the way down. So you need it to be championed from the top. And for that person with a disability to feel welcomed and included, not as the other, not as the employee that you're having that has the disability to tick the box, but that they are actually a genuinely accepted and respected person for their skills and talents. It's not about their disability. So that's definitely something that I see. I think the other thing as well, for me, is around career progression. I think I talked about it for all of us. We don't just stay, some do, but not many of us stay in the same job forever. And where I've seen the most successful employment is, I often get invited to quite a lot of employment ceremonies. We had one the other day where we celebrated about 400 people with different disabilities, getting 5, 10, 20-year tenures with their employers. Fantastic, great. I couldn't be prouder. I knew a lot of those individuals. But if they're doing the same job now that they were doing 20 years ago, I do have an issue with that because often people with a disability or employees we see aren't a part of career progression, aren't a part of performance appraisals. They do tend to just stay in what are generally, if you look at the studies, lower level menial administrative tasks. And so we don't tend to see them in the managerial levels, the leadership levels on boards and things like that. And so I think where I've seen some great tips for successful employment is that people with disability are seen at all different levels of the organisation and are championed with allies at all different levels of the organisation, from your board, your CEO, and all the way through. So they'd definitely be some tips that I think can work. And probably the last one that I would say, and I know we talked about it in our pre-brief, is what I call the cafeteria test. So it's great. There's a lot of things you can do to get a person with a disability a job carving, your reasonable adjustments, great induction. Ideally, that induction would be led by someone with a disability, again, authentically and genuinely. But what I often find is when I visit my friends with disabilities in their workplace, great, obviously I'll look at them doing their job and where they're seated and they're doing that. But what I'll actually look for is the cafeteria test. Are they sitting with the other employees in the lunchroom? Are they on the WhatsApp groups? Are they invited to the after work drinks? Are they invited to the weddings and the birthdays? Because again, for all of us, that's a dimension of work that really makes us feel like we belong. And often you'll see for our loved ones with disability, they're not a part of that side of the workplace. And so that's probably another tip that I would get for really successful employment. Again, not because it's nice to do for the employee with disability, but because it just adds to your whole employee team and we're all better off for it. Again, like both Sri and Amy have said, what's good for one is good for all. So there'd be some tips that I'd like to share.
Thank you.
I agree with Emily in the sense that it can't be a tokenistic job. We need to move away from that because very often, even from my experience of working with different companies and implementing the 2% quota, I feel that some companies see it as, okay, now I have one employee, so I'm covered. I'm not going to have to pay the fine, and I'll just give them, a job of just giving around coffees and, maybe taking some notes at some meetings. We have to move away from that. I mean, persons with disability have aspirations. As Emily was saying, we also want to be included in, in lunches, at, in the social aspect of the job, because it's part of our identity at the end of the day. I mean, whenever we meet someone, the first thing they ask us is, what do you do? Because having a job is actually part of who we are, so it's also the same for persons with disabilities. So we can't keep having this mentality of, us versus them, because they are us as well, in the sense that we all have the same, needs, the same ambitions, the same aspirations. Very often, especially when it comes to people with intellectual disability, and I've worked with some youth and that people tend to think that, they don't want to, have a job, they don't want to maybe get married, be in a relationship, that they, I don't know, that they have other aspirations. Whereas, from the research we carry out and the work that we do, they have the same aspirations as their peers. So it's important to really, I think, include them in all aspects of the job. Another thing that I wanted to mention is, in terms of tips and examples of good practices, having the will from the top, as Emily was saying. I mean, it needs to come from the management that they actually want to employ persons with disabilities, and that they instill this also in the rest of the levels of the company or the corporate agency.
Yeah, I think Francesca, you were on mute, but I understood that you want me to speak, and so I think what my colleagues Emily and Amy just stated is very, very important. A couple of examples of practitioners' view as leaders. They need to understand how to work with individuals that are disabled. And it should not be a tick in the box, as you rightly said. And how do they get motivated? What is the driving factor? Why do they need to really embrace the inclusivity and create an environment where disability is not a weakness, but it's a strength? And I would consider, specific to neurodiversity, they're exceptionally good in driving some of the tasks that neurotypicals may not be able to do. And we tend to pick these neurodivergent individuals who are extremely qualified, perhaps having a PhD, working in a coffee shop, for a minimal wage, even though they're qualified to do a much bigger, better job, we do not hire them. I think that education and having leaders understand what it takes to not hiring based on biases, but based on qualifications. I understand it's not a charity, but it's commercial. End of the day, leaders are trying to run their business, but it's not a negative thing to hire neurodivergent or any disabled individuals. They're qualified or they thrive, but you need to give that lift up. And not only that, hiring is one thing, retaining talent, growing talent, there is a huge opportunity. We tend to hire them just to make the organization look great. But what efforts are we putting in to retain the talent and grow that talent? When there is a reduction in force, we tend to pick these individuals that are hired just because, oh, they're lower in the pyramid. That's not the way leaders have to think. It's an education to leaders. You have to understand do's and don'ts. And you need to understand how to be unbiased, how to really learn from neurodivergent individuals. I can tell you, I'm a better leader before I was working with neurodivergent talent versus after I started working with neurodivergent talent. I'm bold. I'm direct. I don't sugarcoat. It's black and white, not by accident. If we show that as an example as leaders, people do see it. As I mentioned, seeing is believing. Once we start showing results, then people know why they have to do it. It's just not raising their brand, showing that they're hiring divergent talent, a diversity talent, creating an inclusive environment for the sake of creating versus making it be part and parcel of any firm's DNA. That's how it should be.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the time, and I'd like if each of you can just describe one short success story of employment of people with disabilities. And who wants to go first? I'll let you decide.
Doesn't matter. Emily, you want to go first?
Oh, sure, no problem. So I love sharing success stories because, the path to success is never linear. Probably one that stands out for me is one of our largest national football teams. It's Australian rules football, so probably no one else on this call has ever watched it, and it is the most confusing game. So the sport itself, I have no idea about and cannot explain that to you. But it'd be one of our largest codes and one of our largest football teams in Australia. And what probably started out, I will admit, and they will too, as a bit of a tokenistic exercise. They were developing their first ever diversity inclusion plan, which didn't just cover disability, it was broader than that. So they went out to tender for 3 community partners. And so it's sort of like what I said at the start. I'd rather something tokenistic than nothing. So we put our hat in the ring to partner with them to look at their disability employment space. And in that, they set out to employ one person with an intellectual disability, just part-time for 3 years. And so we were successful in that, and that was great. And they were the first of the football teams in Australia to take that approach. And so we started the process, did the placement, did the job carving. I'll admit they were very nervous. It's not something that they'd done before. They also they sort of have a roster, I suppose, that does not suit our loved ones with intellectual disability. Their roster can always change depending on the games. They do a lot of outside work. it's a very robust, fast-paced environment. Not a lot of things are in writing. A lot of things can change at the last minute. So it was certainly a learning curve for both of us in how do we also make this as easy as possible for this potential employer. And fast forward, gosh, only 3 months once we'd identified a suitable candidate who loved his football. Now, fast forward 3 months when I went and did the visit, not only was he there being employed, they'd increased his hours by triple. He was like, I suppose it's back to my cafeteria test. Yes, he was doing his job amazingly, which was the water boy management and the team kit and the field setup. But probably what struck me going there, he was doing his job great, loved getting all his free kit. But that all the team, when they run onto the field, all made the effort to go up and say hello to him first. And it wasn't a token, it was a genuine hello. They all had individual nicknames for him. They had inside jokes. They had bum taps. They had all of that stuff going on. And I was absolutely blown away. But then if that wasn't enough, then because of it, and because the CEO, the leadership, the coaches were also all involved and so committed to this, then they opened it up. And actually, they've now employed 6 people with a disability in varying roles for the women's and the men's team. They include them in press conferences. They're a very visible part of the team. And what the flow-on effect as well is that it's caused them to rethink their policies and procedures as an organisation. So things, they had a HR policy, and at the very end of those is your sort of tokenistic disability inclusion stuff. They fully flipped it and reframed it and started with disability inclusion and have embodied that across all of their policies and procedures. And they didn't necessarily have to do that. It wasn't sort of part of our original contract, if you will. The other thing as well is that our guys are now seen on national TV working for this sporting team. And probably for me, most hearteningly, is they went even beyond just the employment space, and they've done so much for our community. So the team come and have movie nights with hundreds of our community. They give us 600 tickets each year to their games, and they have a dedicated match day to Down syndrome. Again, none of this was in the original contract, and it's them actively coming to us saying, wow, okay, I suppose the stereotypes and the biases that we maybe initially held have been totally flipped on their head, and what more can we do? We had 2 players then come forward and say, we want to do more specifically as players. We want to be ambassadors and do more. And then for me, probably what most heartening is that our younger loved ones with Down syndrome are going to games and they're seeing their future. They're seeing someone like them with Down syndrome on the field, interacting with the team, on TV with a meaningful job, just beaming with pride, as is the family members of the employees with Down syndrome. So for me, it's just been an amazing turnaround in such a quick time. And then it's also now led to other teams within that football code leading the charge as well by seeing how successful it's been. So I think it's been a really great example.
What a great story. I love it.
Right.
Yeah.
Sri, what about you?
Yeah, I have many to share, but congratulations, Emily. I think that's fantastic.
How about one?
One,
Oh, I see a few hearts going up
Yeah.
there, Emily.
yeah, definitely. So this is actually not just hiring. And I mentioned about retaining talent. I actually started this as a program to hire people who are neurodivergents and creating that workplace where we are trying to bring them and make them thrive. What I did not realize, or what none of my colleagues realized, was there are employees that are there for 20 years, 30 years, who are existing employees. Those are neurodivergents. No one even knew, and they didn't even care. And I was in one of the panels like this, passionately talking about neurodivergent talent and the way we started hiring them. And I got an email one day from one of my colleagues that she was not given the right opportunity. She was not treated well by her own manager. She was not growing in her career. She was stressful to go to work every single day. And this is the gist of the email. It was a lengthy email. I read it and I was not happy. And that individual was not part of my organization, but that happened to be a weekend, and I texted her boss's boss, who was the CIO. And I said, I need 5 minutes of your time. And I got him on a call, and I explained, do you know this individual? Do you know what's happening in your organization? And he said, he had zero clue. And then I said, do you mind if I can talk to her direct manager and have a word to really make her direct manager understand what's happening in confidence and not a public humiliation or anything? And he said, go for it. I got the manager into my office and just started the conversation. How are you doing? What's happening? Kind of thing. Turned into the conversation specific to this individual. Then she started ranting. Oh, she's there. She doesn't do the work and this and that. And do you know what you as a leader have to do and what are the things that you should not do? I started coaching. I was wearing my coach hat and started coaching. And I said, please consider me as your big brother. Going forward, can you please do these things and do not do these things? And she made a promise and left my office after 1.5 hour, very deep and emotional conversation. And I got into my day-to-day. And after 5 weeks, I got an email from the same person who sent me the email questioning how these practices are made in that firm. And one thing she said was, I don't know what you did. My life is a day and night difference.
What a great story. And what a great story, an example of how one-on-one conversations can change the situation. And
I have nothing to do with that individual. I have nothing to do with that organization. But when people raise their hand and ask for help, there are people who are willing to help. That's the moral of the story. And if I may take 30 seconds, I will tell one more thing, which is also very, very important. And I actually indirectly mentioned about this during my conversation. It's not only hiring, and retaining the talent is very, very, very important. And as part of the program, we hired an individual who is neurodivergent. And I was running a neurodivergent panel discussion. I asked my admin to go find this individual to be part of the panel. And I got to know he's going to be in the RIF list. And I said, why? Oh, the manager who hired is no longer here with the firm. And there is another one who doesn't understand how to work with this individual. That's why they're trying to get rid of him. And again, I went to the senior most manager and I explained the reason why it's very hard to retain and it's very hard to hire and retain. It's very hard to grow the talent and what kind of example you're building. And by the way, we changed the decision to retain the talent after that conversation. So the moral of the story is, if you raise your hand, there are people who are willing to help. Thank you.
And the second moral of the story is that each one of us can influence something about the work and the atmosphere and the environment that people with disabilities are living in, and how important it is that we step up and that we do this. And if we make a mistake, it's really okay. We can correct it. And don't be afraid to take a risk and have one-on-one conversations, just, daily kinds of conversations that you would have with anyone, even without a disability. So, Amy,
Yes, I think I have as well a number of success stories. One of them was a company who wanted to branch into scanning documents for other government agencies and so offering this new service. And as well, a bit similar to Emily, they wanted to start as a tokenistic job. So they wanted to, tick the box that they were being in line with the 2% quota. So they asked me to help them to find the right person for the job. And we did. They were very, skeptical. They were very nervous about whether this person will be able to do the job, whether she will be included, and whether the other employees will actually accept her. But eventually, I think all of this kind of, all these worries that managers and CEOs tend to have in their heads, once it is actually played out, it tends to, work rather successfully. But it's also very much in line with what she was saying. There needs to be this will from employers basically to ask for help. And we don't know everything, so we can't know everything. It's as academics, we're constantly reviewing other people's work. So it's also important to in this scenario to ask for help, because there are a number of NGOs, there are a number of consultancy firms who are actually, they're willing to help you, to give disability equality training to the other employees, which will eventually help, with negative attitudes, misconceptions in relation to disability. And this person now has been working with this company for about 5 years. She's, included in lunch breaks, she's included in the WhatsApp groups. And they've actually went on to employ other people. And I think that is also the key message that I want to pass on, maybe, that representation is very, very important. When we're hiring, we're not only hiring that one person, but we're also, making an impact and making a change on the family of that one individual with disability, but we're also, paving the way for other employees with disability to be able to join the workforce. So I think, when employers take on this step, they're not just making the change for that one individual or for those two individuals, but they're actually, opening the roads for other future employees. And I think that is very, very important, because otherwise we'll always be stuck in the same situation. We'll never see any changes in the unemployment rate. But this is very important. Emily mentioned that the project flourished so much that they went on to employ other people with intellectual disability. And I think that is so, so very important, that once we have a success story, we make it known, we share it so that others can learn from it and other employers can take the plunge as well.
Thank you so much. So all three of these stories are so inspiring. And talking about help, we do have a resource list for you that we will show you in a few minutes. We have a couple of slides. We're going to start taking your questions and answers now. If there's just one key takeaway from each of you before we go to the Q&A, I think it would be really important. What's one key takeaway that you would like everyone listening to us to have? So let's start as we did at the beginning. Okay, Shri.
Be authentic and be an example, and do it what you say all the time. And if you sugarcoat or if you're a stereotype, people would see it right away. Just be authentic.
Thank you. Emily?
I'm going to say two very quick ones, if that's okay. The first one is assume competence always. Like, make adjustments, like I said at the start, but not concessions. Don't cut corners, because you're effectively then disempowering that employee with a disability. And I often think that it's not that they're not getting it or that it's not working, it's that we've not found the way to make it work, and coming at it more from that lens and reflecting a lot into ourselves in our, preconceived biases too. And I think, Francesca, like you said, that releasing some of that fear of failure, we won't always get it right, and that's okay. But also, I think going on that journey with the employee, and it's a lot of with, not to. And then the other quick one I would say is just that disability isn't homogenous. And I know we are talking about it as one big group, but the needs of an employee with a physical disability vastly different to that with an intellectual disability, even intellectual disability, very different to the needs of someone with Down syndrome. But then even within that, they're an individual first. And just that person first language is really powerful. It's the person first. Like, for example, when you introduced me, Francesca, you didn't say, oh, it's, blonde, lazy eye Emily, who looks very tired today. I'm Emily first. And I think just carrying that through as well, that they're people first and the disability second, if at all. It may not even need to be mentioned.
Amy?
Yes, two things. The first one, I think, is to be open. So be open to making changes. We often, companies often say, but we've always done this, we've always done it this way, or we've been doing it this way for the past 20 years. Unless we're going to be open to change, then nothing is going to change, whether it's, in relation to hiring persons with disabilities or any other aspect of employment. So I think the first one would be open to change. The second point that I wanted to mention is, as with, everything else, there's also a gender disparity when it comes to the employment of disabled women. So very often when it comes to disabled women, they're at the very end of the pyramid. So whether it's education, whether it's employment, men with disability tend to always have, higher rates, etc. So I think we also need to take that into consideration, because as Emily said, disabled people are not a homogeneous group. So this is a very common misconception, that all disabled people, they're just, one group of people who all want the same thing. We're not. There's a gender difference, there's, sexual orientation, there's race, ethnicity, and they all play, into the intersectionality. They intersect with disability, so it's important that we also take that on board.
Mm-hmm. And we've come a long way, looking at Judith, who got a teaching certificate, but because she was sitting in a wheelchair, she was, quote, fire hazard. Language is so important. We used to talk about, that she's autistic, or that autistic woman. She's a woman first. And so our language is the woman with Down syndrome, the woman with autism, and even in the categories that we've been talking about, if you look at autism, there's a whole spectrum. So we can't even generalize in terms of, quote, people with autism. So that's another thing. And also, if we're afraid that we are going to make a mistake when talking to somebody who has a disability, you can say right off, I hope I'm going to get this right as we're talking, because I'm still learning, but X, Y, and Z, so that we can give permission to make mistakes if we need to have mistakes. So there are 3 slides I want to share with you. First, I want to thank our panelists before we go into the Q&A. I think this was such a great discussion. I can't thank you enough for giving of your time, your expertise. I want to thank my team. This is always a team effort. We've done some fabulous work over the last 3 years, but it's always been the team. It's not me standing here alone. I'm representing all of these fabulous women from around the world. And we have a list of resources. Our next slide, please, Ursula. If you would like to take a photo of this slide, please feel free, because there are some really interesting resources here, and I can't go through all of them, but you will find them extraordinarily helpful. And I want to leave you with this woman. Next slide, please, Ursula. Here's Kaylee Williamson, who I spoke about at the beginning. Times are changing when we can see someone like Kaylee, who's a woman, 33 years old, with Down syndrome, the first person with Down syndrome to cross the finish line, in New York City's marathon. And here she is at the end with her mom, who ran alongside her, behind her. I'm not quite sure where. But look at this woman. Not only did she finish the New York City Marathon, but she's modeled for Adidas. She's written a children's book. She does she does all kinds of athletic pursuits, swimming, basketball, martial arts. And the reason why she's able to do all these things is because her mom has always told her, never allow the opinions of others to become the myth that defines you. And that's a good quote for each and every one of us on here, not just for Kaylee. And I want you to know that since I saw her finish the New York City Marathon, I realized that in my presentations, I have never had a slide with a woman with a disability on that slide. And now this has become my final slide in every presentation I do, no matter what the topic is. So that's another thing when you're watching presentations of people. Here's something that you can do. If you don't see people with disabilities presented, you could go up after a presentation and ask how that can be included, because we have to have more exposure to people with disabilities and all of their accomplishments. And that's another thing that each and every one of us can do. We can also ask that question inside of our companies. And if you're the owner of a company, it's a question you can ask yourself. Well, why don't I have a person with a disability employed here? So we could go back to the screen with the panelists, and we're ready to take questions from the Q&A box. Do we have any, Ursula?
Yes, we have 6 questions.
Oh, great.
Yes. The first is from Emily Casca, but this is the person from Australia. She's called Jenny. And how do we foster authentic understanding and authentic acts of inclusion in a workplace? Yes, it is to do with education. I think also that creation of authenticity needs to extend to the education and professional development. Too often does professional learning come across as compliance also, and staff tune out. Education needs to foster empathy and understanding of why we are creating inclusion. And then she adds,
well, let's do one question at a time.
Yeah, it's not exactly a question, you know. Would you like to go on?
Okay.
We need to deliver education that fosters that authentic, deep understanding of those with disability. Overall, what this means is our practice in the workplace needs to always and consistently embody inclusion of people with disability. Then teaching practice when educating and professional learning to improve inclusive practice in a workplace needs to be considered. Activities that create empathy and understanding in the shoes of those who are neurodivergent and with disability. Perhaps a movement away from lecture-style learning, chalk and talk, more approaches that are less traditional, such as role-play training, which places staff in an active learning role in the professional learning session. That's from Jenny from Australia.
Well, Jenny, I think you've answered your own question there. And if people are still doing this chalk and talk training, that's like the dark ages. So I'm not quite sure what company is doing that, but if anybody's on this call that is doing that, please, you could send me an email and I'll be only too happy to give you a few freebies, because that, that is really not appropriate in this day and age. It doesn't help people really learn. So do we have a question in the Q&A?
We have another contribution from Cindy Wu she writes, "Hello everyone, my name is Cindy Wu, an American who is currently a sister of BPW Taiwan, residing in Kaohsiung. I appreciate the valuable insights shared so far. I would like to ask if there are any recommendations on how individuals with disabilities can enhance their resume writing to better highlight their strengths and stand out in the job market. Thank you. That's from Cindy Wu.
Okay, so does somebody want to take that? How do people with disabilities get their skills out in a resume? Well, it's really the same as people who are living without disabilities.
I was about to say that. Actually,
Go ahead.
what is that you can bring onto the table? What is the value add? How are you making a difference? The disability should not be seen as a weakness, or it should not be seen as a qualification. I think it should actually be not a stopper or a showstopper for you. And for you to thrive, the tools that are needed and the skills that are needed, you need to learn them. There are avenues that would enable you to learn, not just by going through the coursework, but having that practical approach, how to embrace in the environment where you can thrive. Of course, the basic schooling and the degrees are relevant and it's important, but having that practical view in getting yourself be embedded into the workplace and how to get hired. And the resume should actually speak what is that you can bring onto the table, I would say. And Amy and Emily, you agree or anything more you want to add?
Yes, if I can add something, obviously what you're saying, Shay, I completely agree with that. But something else a colleague of mine has worked on is specifically for people with intellectual disability. She worked on a project called Chavetta, which in Maltese language means ski. It's called the Chavetta project, where basically they collected a number of video CVs. So rather than a CV in writing, the traditional CV, they interviewed a number of people who have been in their job for a number of years and they're successful, and they put together this video CV. If you want, I can put a link maybe I can send it to Francesca or to Ursula maybe, and you can share it and you can see, and maybe even also embark on something similar in your respective country. So I'll do that.
Great. And we could probably include it somehow on the resource list before this goes to YouTube. So it's
okay. So yeah. I can. I don't think I can add a question as the. Okay, maybe I can type an answer.
Maybe you could put
for Cindy. Yeah.
I don't know that we have that, but if you do send.
So I typed it in as an answer to Cindy Wu. So
okay, great.
Maybe you can access that.
Wonderful.
And it's a project which received EU funding to be done. So it was a successful project.
Emily, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think similar, we run an employment connections program specific to people with intellectual disability and Down syndrome. And a part of that to the question is we actively support them to put their best foot forward. Like Shri said, focus on their strengths and help them navigate that and put their best resume forward, do interview techniques, how to dress well, how to dress for success. So we're giving them the skills, but then also exactly what Amy said, it's not on the person with a disability to do their best to fit into the role. We then are very much back to the employer as well. What are you doing to make the hiring process more accessible? Is the job description and easy to understand? Is there enough time that the job is open for employees with disability to access the information and put together? What formats can they put their resume in? So similar to Amy, is there video formats, other formats, rather than the traditional written format, which is often inaccessible to many people with an intellectual disability. So we definitely take like a dual approach in the hope that they come together in a more accessible way.
Thank you all. One thing that I always talk about when I'm advising somebody on careers is that the PAR, what's the problem that you were involved in? What action did you take? and what was the result, the successful result. And if you talk in that language on your resume and in the interview, it makes it much clearer for the person on the other side to understand exactly what you're capable of doing. And
I think we covered PAR by everyone on this panel today. We spoke about the panel and the actions and the potential results. That's actually fantastic, Francesca. Well put together. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Is there anything else that's on there in the question and answer box?
No, there is only Lauren Bell who is asking. She's writing, "This is such a wonderfully rich and beneficial discussion. Thank you. Will the webinar be available to view after today?" And I can tell you that we will inform all the attendees per email with the link as soon as the video is online. So you will see it on YouTube or over the BPW website.
Thank you.
That's it.
That was the best question for you to answer, Ursula.
Thank you.
All right, so I want to thank our panelists again, Amy, Emily, Shri. What a fantastic discussion. Thank you for everything that you're doing out there in the world to help make this a better world and to help people with disabilities feel valued in the workplace and to have everyone in the workplace realize what a great contribution people with disabilities makes to the goals of the organization. So thank you all for attending. If you want to see, and thanks to my team again. And if you want to see other webinars that my team has produced, they're on the bpw-international.org/webinars, and they're also on YouTube. So we have one on collaborations, a panel on work for women in the 21st century. And now we have this wonderful panel, and there's a few other things. So thank you again to the panelists. It was great, a great opportunity to get to know all of you, and I hope to see you again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.